Hello, welcome to another episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And it's also a pleasure to have my friend and economist, Dr. Alex Salter, with me today. Alex, thank you for joining the Let People Prosper Show.
Vance, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. You know, we've built a good friendship, and I've really enjoyed your work that you've had out over the last couple of years. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So as we get started, let me go ahead and give you your bio for the audience. We're recording this on September 29th, 2022. So just in case, whenever this is released, anything changes, that you'll know when this was going on. Here it is. So Dr. Alex Salter is the Georgie G. Snyder Associate Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. Guns up. The Comparative Economics Research Fellow at TTU's Free Market Institute and an Associate Editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise. Additionally, he is a Sound Money Project Senior Fellow and a Young Voices Senior Contributor. His first book, Money and the Rule of Law, Generality and Predictability in Monetary Institutions, was published by Cambridge University Press in May of 2021. And if you haven't checked it out yet, I'll definitely put that in the show notes page because you should. It's a great read, a lot of good information. And so we're going to cover that and a lot more here today. So, Alex, the first thing that I'd like to ask you, as I ask all my guests, is why do you do what you do? What drives you on a day-to-day basis?
The short answer is that I love the field of economics. I love the economic way of thinking. I love this wonderful toolkit that we have for analyzing human decision-making, especially when it helps us understand a lot of counterintuitive and mysterious things in the world. I got bit by the econ bug when I was an undergraduate. I was majoring in economics just because I thought it was going to help me go on to become an investment banker or something similar in finance. But the more economics classes I took, the more I realized that this is just really fun and really neat. I could definitely see myself doing this as a career. So it was a combination of passion for the subject. And also, I graduated from college in 2010, a time when, understandably, not many people were hiring financiers, given that we were still having some market turmoil following the crisis in 2008 and 2009. So grad school was my best bet, and it was the best decision I ever made. This has been a great job. I love teaching economics. I love the research that I do. My colleagues are great. Couldn't be happier.
Glad to hear it. And I'm glad you got that bug because it's definitely continuing to show the fruit over time. And which classes are you teaching right now?
Right now, I'm teaching my applied business economics class, which is something between introductory and intermediate micro, but geared toward business school students. All the students in the business school have to take this class in order to graduate, no matter what their major is. It's sort of their last required class before they get fully into their electives. And so it's my job to make sure that they don't go out into the world and act in business without understanding markets.
Good to know. I'm glad to hear that. And as you know, I'm a Red Raider. That's where I went to undergrad and graduate school at Texas Tech up there in Lubbock. So it's always got a place in my heart, and been my wife there as well. So it's a really good spot. So I'm glad that you're there and do all the great things that you're doing for the students and writings that you do. And I mean, one thing we didn't mention in your bio is that you're pretty prolific when it comes to publications, you know, in the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, even there in the Lubbock Avalanche journal that you have there. And so you've really hit on some key topics that you have a way of writing where people really can understand. And I wonder if you have any tips for those who might be listening who are trying to write and get into those types of places, what you might share with them.
It takes a lot of practice. A lot of people, myself included when I first started out, think that an op-ed is just a shorter version of an argument that you might otherwise make in alternative outlets, like a policy paper or a scholarly journal article. So when I first started popular writing, I was frankly a little bit cocky. I thought, yeah, I got this. No, it's a completely different thing. Writing like that persuasively for the public is a skill. Nobody is a natural at it. It has to be cultivated over years and years. So the best advice that I can give you is just practice. Get your stuff out there. It's okay if you write bad op-ed drafts. I promise you many of my op-eds early on, and even still today, some of them are not as good as I would like. It just takes practice. But it's a lot of fun doing the writing because that helps you develop your arguments, refine your technique, learn how to talk to people, meet them where they are, and make arguments that they find persuasive. And so in that way, it helps you get outside of your own head and engage people.
Good advice. And I think I'm taking that as well as you're talking. So I need to make sure to work more on that. I think you're exactly right. I mean, it does take a lot of practice and continuing to write and really, it's a trait to have. It's a trait that you can build though over time. And it looks you've definitely done a great job with that. I wonder, kind of with your research, in the research side of things, in the academic, there's quite a difference oftentimes between what we do in our academic type writing versus what we do for a popular audience. What are your research interests and some of the publications you have in the more academic journals that have got you to where you are today?
So I'm really interested in the economics of governance, broadly conceived. I'm interested in things like rules and institutions, property rights, basically the human devised constraints, whether we come up with them intentionally or not, that we place on our behavior to make ourselves predictable, intelligible to other people, that also enable a widespread division of labor and extensive social cooperation, basically understanding the wealth and poverty of nations in very Smithian terms. So that might seem like a strange answer, since most people would call me a macroeconomist. I wrote my dissertation on what's commonly called macroeconomics. My first book is on monetary policy. But I don't approach these topics as a way of further refining some technical model or estimating time series data. I take that economics of governance approach and apply it to central banks, which is something that I think not anywhere near enough economists are serious about doing. Again, if you look at the monetary economics literature, we're trying to figure out the optimal interest rate rule for tinkering with interest rates, or we're trying to figure out what the best rules for a lender of last resort are. But despite how important those questions are, and they are important, there has not been anywhere near enough consideration paid by economists to the fundamental incentive and information problems that central bankers face on a daily basis. And so not enough people are thinking about whether we're asking central bankers, monetary policymakers, to do more than they're really capable of achieving. And I think that that's a problem. We need to unpack that some more.
Certainly. I think you're hitting on some key points here about governance and also institutions and the importance of institutions. It's something that I like to talk a lot about, and just in general, when you think about some of the key economists who have helped craft my thinking around institutions, like Douglas North, but also Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others. And I was fortunate to have Peter Bedke on recently on the show, and had a great conversation with him about the importance of institutions. And you know how he is; he really likes to go off and explain those things. And I think it's because it is essential. I mean, and it's not just the institutions that are out there; it's also about the norms and the values that are within society that aren't necessarily governance. It's not something that the government or politicians can impose their will. It's really about the public at large. I wonder what some of your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, Pete was and remains an important mentor of mine. He was very influential on me in graduate school, and one of my favorite classes that I took was constitutional economics at the graduate level over at George Mason. But I think that you bring up an important point. One of the neat things about the economic way of thinking when we apply it to rules and institutions is that we learn there's a giant difference categorically between government and governance. Governance is a function. It's what we want rules to provide. We want them to provide order to the social world by orienting our behavior, making ourselves predictable with respect to the people we interact with, help diffuse knowledge throughout society so we have the information that we need. That's a sort of functional definition. Government, on the other hand, is one specific institution, right? The contemporary modern nation state. That's not the only form that governance takes, and certainly not the main one that it's taken throughout human history. So if your only understanding of why there is social order, if your only comprehension of why we can have a widespread division of labor and super specialized capital and very high standards of living is because, the government's doing all the right things with respect to enforcing property rights. Well, that's not wrong, but it's very limited, because that means that you can probably understand about 1% of recorded human history, because most of the time institutions just don't work that way. You can't assume that Uncle Sam is going to come riding over the hill to protect your property rights, for example, in a world that's more unpredictable and dangerous than that, which it was until very recently. We have to find other ways of solving these social dilemmas.
Well put. I think one of the books that I read that really helped to shed light on me as I was starting down this kind of journey and the importance of institutions, and it was Why Nations Fail by Osamoglu and Robinson. Just a great overview of the history, what's going on in different countries, and a great way too of like bringing all of these pieces together. I wonder what other types of books or authors would you recommend, or economists would you recommend in this space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of popular books, geez, now you got me at a little bit of a loss.
Uh-oh. Yeah. I threw that one out of
I
left
can, I
field.
can list, I can throw down academic press book titles all day long, but that's only so helpful. That's only so helpful for most readers. I think
Yeah.
the best recent work is going to be Rubin and Koyama,
Hmm.
How the World Got Rich, which is a
Okay.
really interesting story about comparative economic development. And they sort of take on this idea of what happened in this small cluster of countries that eventually spread to a critical mass of other countries that basically got us out of the Malthusian trap, right? For a
Hmm.
while, everyone in the world was poor, and then all of a sudden, some countries started getting rich.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty discontinuous change, right? If you wanted to throw up the economics version of the hockey stick graph, it would be stagnant living standards for about 10,000 years. And then starting at about 1800, we start to see an uptick. And by the late 19th century, in terms of per capita income growth, we're off to the races. So understanding how that happened is probably the single most important question in all of social science. And there are a lot of bad explanations out there, right? There's a lot of explanations that say, oh, it's all about the countries that have natural resources, or it's all about, slavery and colonialism and exploitation.
Hmm.
None of those explanations make any sense when you actually look under the hood and look at the mechanics of them. So there's a deeper, more important story that we need to tell about why parts of the world at least got rich, and also by implication why other parts of the world have not been as quick at advancing their living standards.
And one of the things I think maybe that you'll find and is been written about quite a bit is the importance of economic freedom, right, and liberty and private property rights and rule of law, those sort of things. Where there are roles for government, but they should be as limited as possible so that people can have more opportunity to flourish and do what's going to be in their best interest to meet their unique needs really along the way, which is partially why I've used this mantra of let people prosper, right? Is finding ways that do let people prosper ultimately, which we talk a lot about removing government barriers and things of that nature. But to your point, what you're saying here is, it's deeper than that, though. There are fundamental reasons for what's brought about the improvements to society, to where civil society can flourish, jobs can be created, because for the most part of human history, that just really wasn't the case. It's really a new kind of phenomenon that we're getting into, that we're finding more and more opportunities for people to prosper. I wonder, kind of in your research, of what were some of those key things that may have got us to where we're at today?
Yeah, there is an important story there to tell about economic freedom. Because historically, when you look at countries that got rich, I think that a lot of us would be surprised if we went and look at the size of the public sector when growth in those countries really took off. It wasn't minimal / almost no government by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, pretty much everywhere when countries started getting rich, they had much smaller public sectors as a share of their economy than we have now. There are exceptions, of course. Right, the most notable contemporary one is China, but even they didn't start really improving their living standards until the notable series of economic liberalizations that started in the 1970s. So contingent upon having a supportive culture and contingent upon having the necessary social trust, free enterprise and limited government, constitutionalism, these things really are conducive to markets and economic growth. And I think that they do shoulder a large part of the explanatory burden for why some countries manage to escape the poverty trap that has pervaded the human condition for as long as we've been here. Again, it's not the only story, right? Even with those countries that got rich, they almost always had some restrictions on trade and commerce. Many of those, by the way, weren't because trade and commerce wasn't working, but it was simply a necessary means of public finance and public control over resources necessary to maintain the army and especially the Navy, necessary to protect things like free trade. And so there are important exceptions like national defense exceptions. But for the most part, free enterprise works well. The division of labor works well. Markets work well. They don't always work great, and there are things that we can do about that. But I think that the default perspective of free enterprise is really the way to go if we're serious about understanding the wealth and poverty of nations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I recently talked to Bob Lawson, one of the authors of The Economic Freedom of the World, and we kind of went through some of those and the different measures that they have in there. But you can see those that are near the top in economic freedom, like Hong Kong, Singapore, even Sweden. Some people think, well, Sweden's this socialist country and everything, but
I was
they're
told
actually
that it was a socialist paradise. What's going on?
Right. But there's a lot of freedom that's going on there. Now, not so much in like places like Venezuela, where you don't have that, where they're down to the bottom of economic freedom, and the results show for what's going on there. Even when you look at different states, when you compare maybe Texas and Florida, considered more economically free, compared to places like California and New York, you can really see what those institutional frameworks change and the dynamism that can happen in an economy, kind of like what, Joseph Schumpeter, the creative destruction is allowed to happen more in these marketplaces where prices can move around, but also resources can move to go to where they're going to be most productive. And I think that's what we really find within these systems that provide private property rights, the rule of law, those sort of things, because there's incentive, right? Like there's incentive to innovate and improve things overall because you can benefit from it. If I'm not going to benefit from it and the government, quote unquote, the government or politicians are going to benefit, I have no incentive to do so. And that's what tended to happen so much in recorded history with, kings and queens and monarchy and things of that nature, or dictatorships where we seem to find there's just not that same incentive that goes into this. And as we know in economics, it's really all about trade-offs. What are those trade-offs of human action and interaction that's going on? And so it's really important to kind of take a deeper dive into these other areas. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
I think that that's correct. And it's really important also not to just look at living standards, because that's going to be something that takes a little while longer to show up. Look at migration flows, where people are moving from and moving to. There's not a parade of people looking to get into Venezuela and Cuba in order to make a life for themselves there. In contrast, there is a parade of people leaving those countries trying to come here, even internally to the United States. Right? It was famous 2 summers ago when people were looking at the price of a U-Haul, pick it up in Los Angeles and drop it off in Texas. That price was something like 3 times as high as picking it up in Dallas and dropping it off in Los Angeles. Why is that? Because everyone wanted to leave California and come to Texas, all right? So prices and the movement of people are really telling a story here about the economic model that people actually want to live under.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of economic models and what we're trying to live under, I'd like to pick your brain just a little bit on something that I know you're passionate about and that I'm passionate about too, but it's school choice. And it's something that we've seen happen across the nation. I think right now the gold standard is what's been passed in Arizona, with Governor Ducey there and the legislature passing basically universal school education savings accounts, which works much like a health savings account where you have a certain amount of money that's put on a card or just in an account, and you have access to it to use for different types of educational services, paying for private school, homeschool, other things that you want to use it for, but providing some more types of just choice and competition in the marketplace. And I wonder, and I know we've talked about this, but given your passion for school choice, is your perspective that it's just about that being school choice, or is it something more fundamental to who we are in maybe human capital and economic terms, but something else that's going to improve our lot in life?
Yeah, great question. I am very passionate about school choice. I think it is the premier state level public policy issue of our time. I agree with you that Arizona has the gold standard in terms of legislative reforms. I would love to see something like that happen in Texas. I have my fingers crossed for the upcoming legislative session. We'll see. That's been something that conservatives at the state level in Texas have historically not been strong enough, in my view. And I think that school choice obviously has quite a lot of things going for it. Choice is important. Making sure that you're getting the education that's right for your children is important. It's definitely something that empowers families. But I also think that having a school choice system also reflects something profound about the proper relationship between families and the state. This idea that the state is but the agent of households and families, and that we charter the public sector to advance the interests of fundamental institutions like the family. I think the model that we have right now largely says that educational bureaucrats and teachers unions call the shots. The current education system, if you look at who it actually rewards them. And it often does so by giving families not a lot of control over what's going on in their kids' lives without really disciplining teachers who are not effective. And really, it's asking children to sacrifice, in lots of cases, a quality education that's going to set them back in life. And so that's very much a privilege-centered system where you have families that are wealthy who can already de facto afford school choice. They just have to go and pay private school tuition. Yeah, they'd probably rather not pay the 10 or 15 grand or whatever per year, but they're going to be okay. The real people who can stand to benefit from school choice are the students who the educational system is currently failing. Much more likely to be students from poorer households, much more likely to be students from minority households. These are the people who the current system is letting down. And I think for the sake of freedom and equality, we need to really reform the school system and give the power directly to families. Because again, the whole purpose of this is advancing the interests of students and the well-being of families. To the extent that we have the public sector involved, it's instrumental. We use the public sector because we think it can help us advance these fundamental goods. But as frequently happens with public policy that sort of goes run amok and develop special interest groups, a lot of these groups have become ends in themselves and are milking the system for their own benefit. And I find that undemocratic and unacceptable.
Yes, I agree. And I'm also hopeful that this next session, which starts in January of 2023 here in Texas, that we will get school choice passed. I think one of the important things, yes. He's crossing his fingers if you can't see it. But the thing is that, I mean, look, I think part of this is competition. We're seeing this in the states, which is one of the important things from our founding here in America of federalism, is to allow for this laboratory of competition among the states to come up with new ideas that can be able to advance us in society moving forward and see what works and what doesn't work. And I think when you look at the research that's out there on school choice, Corey DeAngelis, who has done a lot of great work in this space as well, or in general, what you find is that the research shows that not only do you get better outcomes scored by maybe the NAP scores or other types of standardized testing that they do, but it's not only at the private schools, but it's also the public schools. Like the government institutions, they also improve because of the competition. There's increased quality that's out there. Some of the research that I've done in the past too with John Merrifield has looked at the effect that school choice has had on teacher pay. We often hear about the monopoly situation of a lot of these government schools where 90% of students here in Texas go to a government school. But at the same time, 93% of teachers are employed by these public schools. So when you have that situation, it leaves less negotiating power to the teacher and puts more focus on the teachers' unions, politicians, and things of that nature. It's really interesting to see that this hasn't happened in Texas. And as you kind of hinted at, some of it has to do with a lot of the rural Republicans here in the state where they don't necessarily want to go in that direction. I think partially because a large part of their voting bloc, speaking of James Buchanan's rent seeking, right, is just the public school. And so it puts more of a pressure. But I think what you're seeing is some of those roadblocks are starting to be cleared away, as this is a ample opportunity. And a big part of that, Alex, I think, is looking at the economics of what happened during the shutdowns of the schools, kids staying home. Parents started to be a little bit more engaged with what their students were learning, what was being taught in the classroom, what the books and everything else. And, we don't have to necessarily get into all the CRT and other stuff that's out there, but I think just in general, the incentive changed. And we've got to improve our education system to really improve the future prosperity of not only the individuals, which I think is really important for families, but also for the future of America. So I really see it as a pressing issue for our time, maybe the civil rights issue of our time, for us to have school choice and really being able to move forward.
In terms of social equality, again. The single most important thing that you could do to advance it. And I think that part of the reason that you do have some of those rural Republicans in Texas who have historically been more reticent about this, not as enthusiastic about this, partly that's interest, but I also think that partly our side probably hasn't made our case as well as we possibly could. So that's why I think it's really important that we're really explaining to the public now how this would work with a voucher system or an ESA system. Because what a lot of the rural public is worried about is that we're basically going to yank funding out of their communities and send it somewhere else.
Right.
You actually get into the plans and study how this works. You realize, no, it doesn't actually work like this. Here's how the plan works. Here are the feedback mechanisms. Here are your options. It's basically a way of ensuring that people can actually get more of what they want. Now, there's a lot going on there in terms of the breakdown in interest between rural communities and urban communities. And I think that we do need to be honest about the fact that there is going to be a shakeup happening, right? There is going to be a change to the education system if this happens. Yeah. But also this idea that this is going to be completely catastrophic to these places that might have, these small towns that might have one high school and Friday night lights are the very center of the community and that sort of thing. The idea that this is going to completely destroy that, no, that's a scare tactic drawn up by the other side. That's just not how this is going to work.
That's right. Let's keep working on it. And thank you for all the efforts that you're doing in that space. Let's move on to your book now, which I have here, Money and the Rule of Law. Generality and Predictability in Monetary Institutions, which is with Peter Bedke and Daniel Smith. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of important points throughout the book. I really like how it's laid out. For the audience, there's not a lot of numbers there or anything. It's really more of a narrative. I mean, there's actually very few charts, even if you don't like charts. If that starts to scare you somehow, there's not even a lot of charts. But it really provides a lot of the overview of what's going on in the monetary system, but just in institutions in general. So, Alex, why don't you take some time to give us a good overview of the book and some of your key points?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So as you may have noticed, we're currently experiencing a mess up with respect to monetary policy. Inflation is now at levels that we haven't really seen in 40 years. And when you unpack all the explanations, there's some supply issues going on. There's some extraordinary challenges, pandemic bottlenecks, the war in Ukraine, all this stuff is happening. But if you look at all the variables that are telling you about the stance of money, it looks pretty clear like we just had a massive aggregate demand surge, which basically means a massive surge in total final goods and services dollar spending. Managing that is supposed to be the Fed's job. We thought that we had that down ever since the Volcker disinflation. We had this idea that we had central banking more or less solved. But in the span of 10 years, well, just a little over 10 years, right, we had the global financial crisis, right, which monetary policy messed up both beforehand and afterwards. And we had the aftermath of COVID, when one of the reasons that we're seeing this inflation right now is that central banks thought that they had to step in and help support the market for government debt, given all the massive fiscal packages that were passed during this period. So it really does seem that everything old is new again. We keep on making the same mistakes of yesteryear, and it's really not clear at all that the Federal Reserve has improved on policy over 100 years of its existence. Right, there are some things that look better now compared to before World War II, right? The Great Depression skews the data, and so it makes it look things worse than they really are. But this is not terribly incomprehensible stuff. You would like to think that central bankers would be doing a better job than this. And so we answer the question of why aren't they doing a better job than this? Because the job itself cannot be done well given the current structure of central bank. We've basically given monetary policymakers discretionary authority over what policy looks like, both the intermediate objectives of policy, what we're actually trying to achieve, and how we go about achieving it. And that creates way too much latitude for policymakers to confuse markets, to give them unpleasant surprises, for households and businesses to form incompatible expectations with respect to what policymakers are doing. Discretion in monetary policy does not work. It's too open-ended, it's too vague, it cannot provide a secure foundation for market economic activity. If we insist on having a central bank, and we assume that the answer to that question is yes for the purposes of this discussion in the book. If we insist on having a central bank, we need to put monetary policy on a strict rules-bound footing. We basically need to say, okay, here's the objective of monetary policy. You're going to stabilize this variable. You're going to try and hit, X% inflation every year or a band around that. Here are the tools that you're going to have at your disposal to achieve that. Here's the rule that you have to follow. Now, because of that certainty provided by a rule that cannot be misinterpreted by wishy-washy bureaucrats, that's going to give markets the stability they need to make sure that we're allocating resources to their highest valued uses. And also, by the way, avoid the downside associated with demand-triggered recessions. There's really not anything you can do about supply-side recessions. When COVID happens, there's nothing monetary policy can do about that. It sucks. We just have to take it. But we can deal with demand-side recessions. That's the whole reason central banks exist. As we've seen, unfortunately, they're not very good at dealing with them, so we have to reform them at a fundamental level if we want them to actually achieve this goal that we've chartered them to achieve.
I think that's a really good overview. And, for the audience too, I mean, central banking has been an issue in America almost since the founding with the first central bank, Alexander Hamilton and some others. And then that was shut down. They had the second central bank, and then that one. And then was it 1913? Well, we had the Aldrich Commission in 1907?
I think that's right.
Together. Yeah, I think it was 1907, and there was the banking panic of 1907, and so the Aldrich Commission was after that, and they started to decide, okay, what's going to be next? What can we do as a government in order to keep these sort of banking panics from happening? Because, I mean, there were quite a few when you look at the 19th century and everything. And then so in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was put into place, signed by President Wilson. And at that time, though, the Federal Reserve was really seemed to be a lender of last resort. It wasn't supposed to be that much involved at that time with what's going on in the economy. I wonder, from your perspective, what would be some of the key things that changed over time with the Fed? So the audience, maybe they may not have known a lot about the history of the Fed. You don't have to go through all the details, but what are some of the key highlights that you'd share?
I'm glad that you brought up the history beforehand, because in order to understand how the Fed changed, you really need to know at least a little something about the history of money and banking in the United States. Contrary to the United States mythos of cowboy capitalism, money and banking has always been very tightly controlled, first at the state and local level, and then eventually at the federal level. We've never had anything like a free enterprise system in money and banking. And that's why, by the way, the history of banking in the United States has been so unstable. There are many counterproductive regulations, again, first at the state and then at the national level, that made the U.S. system artificially fragile. And so you had the first and second bank of the United States, which weren't truly central banks. They were more just privileged banks that provided banking services to the government. Then you had the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, as you pointed out. And yes, its advocates said, we're basically trying to start an augmented quasi-public clearinghouse.
Mm-hmm.
In the age of the telegraph, when that's the fastest communication, we wanted to develop a better system from getting emergency liquidity from, San Francisco to New York to help stave off banking panics. Of course, not long after the Fed is created, World War I rolls around, and the Federal Reserve starts experimenting with the first of what we now call monetary policy powers to support the market for U.S. government debt to help fight the war effort. Well, once these things happen, we're sort of off to the races. There's always mission creep that pushes the Fed into something new, and it always seems like there's a good justification for what it does. And each time it exceeds its mandate and authority just a little bit, it becomes a little bit less accountable and a little bit harder to actually rein back in. So I think that the story of the Federal Reserve is really a story of bureaucratic mission creep writ large, that nobody has found a way to actually get some control over that process. I do fear that we're running out of time to do that, because we just keep on getting more expansive. The central bank keeps on branching out into more areas that, frankly, it doesn't have any mandate or competence in. There's absolutely no reason we should want our central bank to care about climate change or economic justice. I'm not saying that there's no reason we should want our government to care about those things, right?
Sure.
There's no reason we should want the central bank to have those things in its portfolio. And the argument for the Fed, for taking on those duties a little bit has been, frankly, laughably weak. And I'm actually a little bit surprised that they continue to make them. And yet they're going to keep on doing them, right? Despite the fact that they can't seem to manage the money supply, they're going to solve climate change somehow. So I'm really skeptical that the central bank is sufficiently competent to deal with even the most basic things. I think that we need to stop all those more exotic policies. With respect to regulation, the only thing I want the Fed to do is make sure that banks maintain adequate short-term capital. And with respect to monetary policy, all it really should be doing is following a rule. So we need major changes to the Federal Reserve to keep it not only accountable to the people, but just to make it effective at achieving the goals that make us want it in the first place. On net, I think the Fed has been destructive of economic stability and activity, but that's a disputed hypothesis in the macroeconomics literature.
Well, economists always like to have good debates about different things. We have so many arms, right? So many hands.
On one hand.
But, thinking about the history of the Fed, one of the key things was it 1946 whenever they had the dual mandate?
1971.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm thinking about something else. But 1971.
Thinking of the Full Employment Act of 1946, which is a little bit of a different thing.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. But the dual mandate then in 1971 with price stability on one end and then full employment on the other, there are some trade-offs again. Between those two. There's some tension that happens between those two. And I know that you've been writing about this quite a bit. What's your take?
Sure. So interestingly, everyone talks about the dual mandate. I often write about the dual mandate. If you actually look at the legislation, it's a tripartite mandate. There's a third line to it. The Federal Reserve is supposed to achieve stable prices, full employment, and, quote, moderate long-run interest rates, unquote. Everybody has just sort of agreed to ignore the last part of that plank. Because the vast majority of economists now think that moderate to long-run interest rates are more or less independent of monetary policy. they come down to what we call real, meaning non-monetary factors. Labor, capital, natural resources, laws and institutions, productivity, these things determine moderate to long-run interest rates, medium-term to long-run interest rates. And monetary policy can't really affect those for very long. And so because of that, everyone just sort of had this gentleman's agreement that we weren't going to talk about the third plank. And there might be good economic reasons for that, but note how that reinforces the narrative of this thing is out of control, right? We passed legislation saying that this is a part of the mandate, and they just ignored it and we're okay with it. I'm actually a little bit happy about that because, again, it's asking them to do something that they can't do. But I think it also shows the problem of allowing the central bank to be a law unto itself and a judge in its own cause. If they get to choose the rules and mandates and planks that they follow and not, in no meaningful sense do we have a rule-bound central bank. The rule of law, the idea that laws are supposed to be general, equally applicable, all these things that we take for granted for other public institutions, has not really yet been applied to central banking. And I actually think that it's more important that we apply it to central banking, given the immense power they have to create money and purchasing power out of thin air. Given that power, given their ability to create currency reserves, given their ability to allocate credit, we really need to keep this thing on a tight leash because it's just begging to be abused for political, if not outright partisan purposes. With respect to the unemployment inflation trade-off, there's a lot of that going around in the popular press right now. I actually have a different perspective on this. I actually don't think that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You sometimes get this narrative that there's this menu of policy options, right? We can run the economy quote unquote hot, in which case inflation will be high and unemployment low, or we can run the economy quote unquote cool and inflation will slow down, but we got to pick an uptick in unemployment. And the idea is judicious technocrats can sort of pick the right combination thereof to get the most out of economic performance. In reality, though, what matters is unemployment is ultimately determined by how productive the economy is, how many people you can put to work. Unexpectedly easy monetary policy can temporarily lower unemployment, but as soon as people are figuring out that the economy is booming just because of funny money and not because of any fundamental strength, prices are going to go up and unemployment's going to go back up too. We're going to get back to where we were before, and the only difference is going to be sustained inflation. And so I really don't think that we should be talking about a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. I think that what we should be talking about instead is the Federal Reserve picking an inflation target, if in fact it wants to target inflation, telling markets, okay, we're going to hit 2% every single year or get as close to it as possible. Now, all of a sudden, we have good predictability about the long-run purchasing power of the dollar, about what sort of inflationary expectations we need to bake into our financial contracts, right? If we're workers, we know what we need to build into our wage negotiations when we're bargaining with our employer for future raises. Once everybody knows the rules of the game, they can coordinate and maximize the productive powers of markets. But that requires a central bank to pick a target and stick to it and credibly maintain it. So it's not so much about an inflation and unemployment trade-off. It's about setting a strong foundation and then letting markets get unemployment as low as they can be, conditional on that strong foundation.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. I didn't know much about that third goal either. I had overlooked that on the long-term
interest rate. There is, right, in terms of monetary policy. I only found out about it comparatively recently. I think like a year ago. I was reading a the Fed St. Louis branch report where it actually talked about the dual mandate. The very first sentence was, actually, there's a tripartite mandate, and here's the legislative language. And I did a double take. I was thinking, I'd never heard of this.
Yeah.
That was pretty interesting.
That is. One thing that I want to do, too, is in the show notes, I'll put Milton Friedman's Nobel lecture on the lack of the trade-off between unemployment. The Phillips curve really is what we're talking about here, that there's not a long-term Phillips curve trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation. And I think we're finding that out even more now as we're continuing to run into some of these problems again. Speaking of kind of putting in some of the current events about what's happening now with what you've been working on with this book, Money and the Rule of Law, your other research and everything else. I mean, there's so much to unpack. And, in the last maybe 10 minutes or so that we have here, I'd love to get your thoughts on what's been going on in the economy. You shared a little bit with the Great Recession, which is the financial situation of the 2000s. Now we have this shutdown situation. You and I have been talking about this for a couple of years now. I knew at one point in time you were more on the transitory inflation sort of camp, quote unquote camp. And then now it changed over time. But of course, there were a lot of variables that were moving around and stuff like that. And one thing I did want to say just real quick is that even the larger macro models are still using a lot of this Phillips curve trade-off. Even whenever I was at the White House, the troika that was in, so was the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget, chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors, and the chief economist for the Treasury and their staff. In those macro models, it's still used like the Phillips curve. And I was like, no, we can't use this, And so it's interesting to see how long, even though something can be debunked, it stays with us, But I'm wondering is what have you been thinking about the economy, and how has your views kind of changed given your knowledge and the understanding of what's been happening in the past of what's going on now?
That's right. As recently as last autumn, probably around October is when I started to change my mind. But as recently as last autumn, I was on team transitory. I thought the inflation that was beginning to rise was primarily due to supply side considerations. And that's because I misread what was happening to money demand. I just didn't think that I had a good enough picture in terms of where money demand was going. In retrospect, you might think that I probably should have gotten that prediction better, since there was evidence at the time that although the demand for liquidity spiked during the early days of the COVID crisis, it pretty quickly leveled off, yet the money supply kept growing. So in terms of forecasting what was going to continue happening to money demand, I got that wrong, right? It stayed level rather than continuing to grow. And when money supply growth exceeds money demand growth, all that excess liquidity's got to go somewhere, right? It's getting pumped into the economy and driving up prices, right? So I got that prediction wrong.
And Alex, just real quick, is the construct that you're thinking of whenever you're talking about money demand and money supply, are you using like the equation of exchange, money growth times velocity, or money times velocity is equal to the price times real GDP?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So a lot of people, so when I say money demand, I don't mean in a colloquial sense how much money we want. Obviously, we all want as much money as we can possibly get. We're talking specifically about what fraction of your income and or wealth you choose to hold in the form of highly liquid assets. And so when money demand is higher, you're more willing to hold on to liquidity, so it's not going to drive up prices as much. And of course, when money demand is lower, all else being equal, you're willing to hold less highly liquid assets. And so that's going to tend to boost nominal spending, not final output on goods and services, but basically how expensive it is in the long run. That gets to the link between inflation and the money supply. What I really find inexplicable is that as recently as winter, it was pretty clear that the transitory stuff was wrong. It was pretty clear that I and everybody else who was on team transitory should have said, okay, we need to revise this thing and rethink this thing. And yet monetary policy didn't start tightening until significantly later. And even then, the tightening that we've seen has not been remarkable in any sense of the word, I would think. If you listen to what market commentators are saying, they're saying, the Fed's engaged in unprecedented tightening. Well, if you factor in inflation, real interest rates are something like negative 5% still. The short-run interest rate consistent with a Taylor rule, right, pioneered by John Taylor, arguably the world's greatest living monetary economist, and I hope a future Nobel laureate. The level of that policy rate should be about 10%, right? And it's like 3 to 3.25 now. And the money supply is growing at about 1% per year, which isn't very much. But again, money demand is static. So the money supply is continuing to outgrow money demand. All of these are not a picture of tight money. It's not easy money, right? But if you were going to say that the Federal Reserve is catastrophically slamming on the brakes and then gave me this data, I would be a little bit confused. Because this looks tight only in comparison to previous policy, which as we now know was loosey-goosey. So tighter monetary policy does not mean tight on any objective sense. And so I would like to see the Federal Reserve actually get a little bit quicker, especially to unwinding its balance sheet. I'm paying more attention to that than I am interest rates. In terms of the other economic patterns that you have going on, I'm a little bit pessimistic about what's going on the supply side. This Congress and this administration is not doing the nation any economic favors with its agenda. In brief, they seem committed to a combination of stimulating demand while restricting supply, which is going to really not make goods and services all that more abundant, if at all, but it sure as heck is going to make them expensive. And so when I look at the various packages that are coming out, especially congressional proposed legislation, I can't help but think that this is really going to hamper the productive capacity of the economy at a time when we really can't afford any more economic pain, right? Real wages have been falling for more than a year, I think closer to 2 years now. And so we're going to compound that by having all these schemes that redirect productive resources away from their highest value uses and steer them to politically motivated projects to reward special interest groups. That's not good for the American people. That might be good for partisan coalition building, but that's not what we send these people to do. We should expect an economic policy from our administration and our Congress that benefits the nation as a whole. And right now it's not doing that. They can't really control what the Fed is doing, right? That's by design. We can debate whether that's a good idea or not, that degree of independence from politics. But in terms of what the politicians can control, yeah, they're not getting a passing grade for me.
No, same here. Not for me either. And I think when you look at the last 2 years, actually 2+ years now, it's quite extraordinary. I know there's this common phrase like this time is different, right? And it's overused. Yeah, it's overused. In many ways, this time is different in the sense that we've never shut down an economy before. We didn't know, speaking of the knowledge problem, Hayek's knowledge problem is that you don't have all the information that's going to happen as you go into the shutdown from the pandemic and COVID-19 and everything else that was happening then. There was a lot of pressure on policymakers to try to make the best decision that they thought was going to be for people, right? I think maybe looking back, we probably should have done some things different, but we only have the facts. We only know what's happened now.
That's right.
And as economists, as social scientists, we only know how people act and behave. We try to think about some other sort of opportunities of what could have happened. But ceteris paribus, these are the things that happened at that time. But then we know what happened during the shutdowns was that there was some massive expansions of government spending. You had the CARES Act of like $2 trillion and the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, to try to keep businesses connected with workers so they can continue to fund them throughout that time. There were checks that were sent out to people. There were people that were put on to Medicaid if they lost their health insurance or they lost their job who couldn't age out or income out. Like the eligibility criteria is kind of off the table now. If you were on Medicaid during this time, you don't have to get off until the public health emergency by the Secretary of Health and Human Services says that it's over.
That's right.
Whenever that's going to be. Then you had the American Rescue Plan Act when the Biden administration came in, another $2 trillion. I mean, you add it all up, and it was close to, I think, around $7 trillion, which, of course, went straight to the national debt. We're now at $31 trillion in national debt, which is about $250,000 owed per taxpayer across the United States. We're up to about 130%, I think, of GDP, somewhere right around that range of debt to GDP ratio. So these are some massive problems that are going on. And of course, the Fed was monetizing a lot of that throughout the process. Their balance sheet went from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. There's going to come a cost to this debt. Nothing is free, right? And it either was going to come in the form of substantially higher interest rates, or it was going to come in the form of higher inflation, as that money was going to trickle through the economy, but have distortions throughout the process. Alex, one of the things that I think is important to think about is what's called the Cantillon effects, right? The different orders of production of how the money goes through the economy. It doesn't just go in through one, it's kind of trickles down, if you will. Maybe that's the real trickle down economics, where it kind of goes through that way. But as you said so eloquently earlier, we had too much money come into the economy, chasing too few goods, one way to think about inflation. And you're right. From the measures that were put in place that started in the Trump administration of reducing, and basically getting people to stay home through the acts of Congress and paying people to stay home, to then the Biden administration coming in, and now they've been raising taxes, they've raised regulations, they've basically cut off a lot of the oil and gas activity. So you're not going to see that same supply increases that you would. So demand is going to be greater than supply. We're going to see higher levels of inflation. And I'm just kind of wondering, what are some of the big lessons that we should learn moving forward to hopefully not have this happen again, but also how do we come out of this without this really being an even harder landing than what we're already having?
In terms of avoiding a hard landing, I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
It's going to require an entire set of propitious circumstances that I'm not really sure that we can bank on. And so I'm not thinking that we're going to have an economic catastrophe, total meltdown. I'm not predicting that the United States is going to have it as rough this winter, for example, as Europe is going to have it for very different reasons. But yeah, we definitely need to get back to a position of basic economic sanity. We need to get back to actually paying a reasonable share of our expenses as we undertake public expenditures. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road with respect to racking up mountains of debt. Even if we wanted to, it's irresponsible of whether we want to or not. But even if we were so inclined to do that, a world in which the real rate of interest is higher because of various global economic forces is going to mean that the cost of that borrowing is not going to be what it once was. We're sort of treating 2008 through 2020 like we're always going to be able to borrow at those rates. And I think that that's unduly optimistic. I just don't think that that's true. So we have to reform our fiscal processes. We have to get spending growth under control. We really got to get money growth under control, ideally by forcing the Fed to follow a rule. And we need to embrace a sanier regulatory agenda. I'm not sure how some public servants got in their heads the idea that by creating a Byzantine web of difficult to comply with regulations, we're going to make production easier and more abundant. Almost the opposite is pretty much going to be the case. So we have this vast regulatory apparatus, which has really gotten out of control, and it sort of acts as a rulemaking and lawmaking body in and of itself, which it's not supposed to do. If we are going to have these regulatory bodies providing some basic oversight, we need to keep the rules that they promulgate simple, predictable, and general. No micromanaging, no picking winners and losers. If we want a more expansive role for public policy and sort of directing the economy towards substantive goods, we need to be happy with doing that at the state level and no higher. And that gets us back to federalism like we talked about before. We need to have these experiments and we need to keep them small in scale so that these costs and mistakes that are inadvertently discovered in one state don't spill over to other states, right? When you get economic policy wrong from Washington, that's 330 million people who suffer. But if we get it right, that's 330 million people who benefit. Show me an example of getting it right. I'll wait. It's just not going to happen. You have this knowledge and incentive environment that's not conducive to the formation of public policy that's actually in the public interest. And so we really need to get back to an economic agenda of restraint and prudence.
Yes.
Restrained spending, prudent monetary policy, a light regulatory touch. And again, we don't need to work miracles. We don't need to suddenly destroy the deficit tomorrow and get it back to a balanced budget. We just need to grow spending more slowly than the economy. We don't need to get rid of the Federal Reserve. We just need to give it a rule. By all means, if you want to get rid of the Fed, I'll talk to you about it. I think that's a good idea too. But we don't have to do that, right? Yeah. Good enough is good enough, right? You've heard the expression "good enough for government work." Well, we're talking about government work after all. So let's settle for half a loaf.
Well, I would like to end the Fed. I think that would be a great thing, and we should talk about that more maybe another time and have more details. But and the last couple of minutes that we have
entirely on that, I'm there.
That's true. Maybe the last couple of minutes, just I want to dive into a little bit more on the rules policies. Right? You and I have written a couple commentaries on the importance of rules, both fiscal and monetary, the combination of the two, which are very important, because if you only focus on one, then that's going to lead the other one with discretion, which wouldn't be good. And in a lot of ways, right, the Fed, since we have a fiat currency system run on debt, they're buying a lot of the debt from the Treasury. So in some ways, that debt of excessive government spending by Congress is fueling the fire of whatever the Fed wants to do. Now, they can go out and buy other assets as well, like mortgage-backed securities and commercial paper that they've done in the past, but it's still dominated on their balance sheet with Treasury securities overall. And my take, I'd love to see a spending limit based on population growth and inflation, which typically grows by less than the overall economy, to your point earlier. So that way you can see a shrinking share of government for the overall private sector of the economy so it can flourish more. But on monetary policy, and you can talk about fiscal policy too if you'd like, but on monetary policy, one of the things that I liked about the book a lot, right, Money and the Rule of Law, is that you don't necessarily take a position on a specific rule, but just the importance of rules, which is really kind of where I'm at too. But there's a lot of good talk out there about nominal GDP targeting. There's the Taylor rule, which looks more at the interest rate based on trade-offs between the unemployment rate and inflation and the real interest rates that are out there. There's the money growth rule, kind of the Friedman idea back in the day. What is your take on these types of rules?
I definitely agree that we should reform both fiscal and monetary policy at the same time. If you've got a leaky boat that's leaking from multiple places, you're not going to keep the craft afloat if you plug only one of them. And that's even an imperfect metaphor because one of the errors actually compounds and augments the other. And so this idea that you put it pretty nicely, right? All these deficits that rack up debt actually add kindling to the fire that's already, raging with respect to out of control monetary policy. And so because excessive spending pressures central bankers for political reasons to make more accommodative debt market conditions for their governments, you can't really get control over the fiscal and monetary process without tackling both of them. They're almost like a single conjoined institution. It might even be more helpful to think about currency debasement and debt and deficits and all these things as the single outcome of an institutional process that, even though it's not formally linked, right? The Federal Reserve is independent, Congress is its own thing. Nonetheless, there are very much pressures operating back and forth between these sectors of the public economy, such that deficits pressure central bankers to be easy, and easy monetary policy makes it easier to run deficits, right? And so you don't need to be actively in cahoots with the guy for your policy to benefit him and his yours. And so we're sort of having a pernicious example of spontaneous order, I guess FAI call it. Yeah, the rules debate is tough. There's a lot of good arguments on all sides in terms of the rules that people want to pick. I'm a nominal GDP targeting guy. I like the idea of the Fed directly stabilizing aggregate demand, so long as we A, have the Fed, and B, want it to follow a rule. I think an inflation target is also defensible. The Taylor rule, I primarily think, is more helpful as a weather vane internal to central banks for policymakers. I don't like relying over much on the connection between monetary policy and interest rates, because ultimately monetary policy isn't about interest rates. Interest is the price of capital, which means it should be determined by supply and demand in capital markets, right? It's the price of time, the price of intertemporally allocating purchasing power from future you to present you. Or if you're a supplier, right, present you to future you. So interest rates can be one tool in the toolkit for monetary policy, but in terms of what they're ultimately trying to achieve, and in terms of the benchmark, right, how we actually know whether we're getting it done, I think that nominal gross domestic product, total spending on new goods and services valued in current dollars, not adjusted for inflation, that's going to be the clearest barometer of monetary policy. And that's going to be the thing that we want central banks to target, so long as we continue putting up with them. So giving the central bank something like an NGDP target, failing that, an inflation target, for which there are actual penalties that it breaks, it's actually be teeth. A rule that doesn't bind isn't a rule at all. Combined with fiscal reforms, right? I do like your idea of keeping government spending at or below population growth plus inflation growth, since that's sort of like a temporary freeze on government. If you follow that rule, the amount of real resources being spent per person by the federal government remains more or less constant, which is, I think, a good way of making sure that we get some breathing room and the economy can actually grow into the debt that we've already accumulated, and that might be a safer position for us. So in terms of reforming the process, it's pretty much rules all the way down. And if that doesn't work, well, then, golly, we're really in trouble.
Yeah. Well, Alex, it's always a pleasure to talk with you and get your insights on what's going on. I'd love to have you back on the show, because we probably have a lot more stuff that we could talk about and kind of dive into some of these areas. But I really appreciate your happy warrior attitude, and I hope that your family and you are continuing to be blessed in many ways. And thank you so much for being on the show.
It was my pleasure, Vance. God bless you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all again for joining us, the Let People Prosper Show. I hope you have a prosperous day, and we'll see you here next time. Thank you.